This is a special episode of the podcast. If you're looking for the full commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, I recommend starting with episode 1. There are 67 regular episodes. Well, they're really 68 because one of them was split up into 2 episodes, A and B. So there are 68 regular episodes that run through every passage in Matthew, reading it through a socio-literary lens, with a few special episodes sprinkled among them, and then at the end, more special episodes, of which this is one. This episode relates the Gospel of Matthew to what is going on now in Palestine. I've said on this podcast, and many others have said before me, that our social location affects the way we read the Bible, or any text really. It's not the only thing, there are other factors, but social location is an important one. So is any reality that we are subjected to, or any information about our world that we receive. These things affect how we interpret the text. Well, recently, many of us have been watching through various media the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And for some of us, we have been long aware of the slow ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, as well as the siege on Gaza before October 7th, and how even nonviolent protests by Palestinians against Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank have been met with brutal and deadly force. But before the events of recent months, many of us were sort of lulled into complacency. We had many other things to attend to, and the events in Palestine were ongoing and sort of normalized. So we weren't paying attention as much. But now it's different. Many of us are not only paying attention, we are organizing. Here in Pasadena, California, in the United States, where I live, some of us have been rallying in front of the local office of our congressional representative, Judy Chu, every Monday evening since late October. We also have organized, and we were able to get our city council to pass a resolution for a ceasefire. Additionally, we have organized fundraising because some of the people in our group are from Gaza, and their families were there, and we raised money to get them out of Gaza. Our local group consists of Muslims, Jews, Christians, people of other faiths, and non-religious people. At the end of every vigil, we read an interfaith prayer together. One woman who is from Gaza and has lost many family members there has called us her new family, an honor in which I feel unworthy to partake. All of this has had an effect on how I read the gospel, and now one aspect of it, a very central aspect, has been illuminated for me, and that is what this special episode is about. I think that the Gospel of Matthew was written for such a time as this. Recently, I've come to this new conclusion about why the Gospel of Matthew was written. And this could apply perhaps to the other 3 Gospels in the New Testament, but this podcast is on Matthew, so I'm going to talk about it in terms of Matthew. I came to this new conclusion so gradually that it was difficult at first to identify that I'd come to this new conclusion. It was hard to distinguish it from what I'd been saying before, but it is a really important distinction. I'd been saying all along that the tragedy, the catastrophe that happened in the year 70, the destruction of Israel in the year 70, or rather in the years 66 to 74, because while Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in the year 70, other towns and villages were destroyed or attacked in the years surrounding that, so that virtually all of Israel, or most of Israel, was destroyed in those years. Many towns and villages in addition to Jerusalem. So I'd been saying that that tragedy or that event is part of the backdrop of the Gospel of Matthew. So it influenced some of the passages in Matthew, perhaps influenced all of Matthew. But now I think that the Gospel of Matthew was written specifically for an audience that had just come through that catastrophe, that was still reeling from it. I now think that the events of 66 to 74 are what the Gospel of Matthew was addressing. So those events, that catastrophe, is what shaped the Gospel, why it was written the way it was, and perhaps why it was even written at all. And when I say catastrophe, that may not communicate well the scope of what actually happened. The events of those years were those of a Holocaust, a genocide. Israel was virtually destroyed. Thousands of Jews were killed and thousands taken into slavery. And not only were many Jews just killed, thousands of them were crucified. Crucifixion was the ultimate punishment that Rome meted out against its enemies. It was a slow, painful, public death where the victim was exposed, shamed while being tortured to death. That is how thousands of Jews were executed. Israel was literally crucified. So any story written in the late 1st century, as Matthew was, about a Jewish Messiah who is crucified, would have reminded its audience of the crucifixion of Israel. That Messiah would have been seen as a stand-in for Israel. And not only that, but Jesus in the story cries out from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Ancient Jewish writers talked about God abandoning Israel at its crucifixion. The temple was destroyed, and the temple was the place that God was believed to dwell in Israel. Ancient Jewish writers surmised that God had abandoned the temple and allowed Rome to destroy it. In other words, God had abandoned Israel and allowed it to be crucified. So the cry of Jesus from the cross is not just a quote from Psalm 22. It is Jesus, through the psalm, crying the cry of his people, my God, why have you abandoned us?" The whole climax of the gospel story parallels, or is even about, the crucifixion of Israel. Add to that chapter 24 describes the events of that catastrophe, that Holocaust, and it becomes apparent that this story was written to address that event. It may still be a universal story that can address all people everywhere, but it started out as a story to address this specific genocide, this specific Holocaust. The story is universal not only because catastrophes and tragedies happen every day on a personal and collective level, but also because on the collective level, genocides continue to happen. And we are witnessing one right now in Gaza. I'll come back to that, but first let me talk about the audience that Matthew addresses. The audience is primarily a Jewish audience, although it could be partly a Gentile audience, Gentiles who were very familiar with the events of 66 to 74, as no doubt many would be because it was international news at the time. But the audience is also specifically an audience of Jesus followers. These were people who not only followed Jesus, but also who carried on his work after he was gone. Jesus, according to Matthew, was a community organizer. According to Matthew, he organized a movement of peasants and social outcasts, and also allies from the upper classes. It was a movement to bring about God's new society that he called the kingdom of heaven, to bring about that new society here on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus taught them the ethos of the new society in the Sermon on the Mount and through his parables and other teachings. He taught them that it would be a radically egalitarian society in which the first would be last and the last first. Jesus empowered the people, the crowds. Jesus healed and fed them, and then gave them authority to heal and feed each other. He spoke and debated in the synagogues, which were the town councils, and told his followers that they would do the same. He demonstrated to them how to debate people in power and how to win those debates. Jesus was a community organizer, and he trained his followers to be community organizers. And so after he was gone, they continued to organize for the new society in very difficult conditions, in extreme poverty, suffering under a brutal Roman occupation. They organized for more than 30 years after Jesus had left them. They spoke in town councils and debated people in power. They were flogged and beaten, even stoned and crucified. But the movement grew. They established ecclesias, a word that gets translated as churches, but these ecclesias were very different from what we think of as churches today. They were radically egalitarian communities of mutual aid. This is how they would transform society and defeat the empire, through these alternative communities called ecclesias. And they were making slow, steady, tortured progress for more than 30 years. And then catastrophe struck. There was a peasant uprising against Rome, and the Roman response was brutal. Everything they had worked for, everything they had suffered for, everything some of them had died for, was suddenly all gone, washed away in a bloody flood of Roman genocidal vengeance. Rather than a new society, they were left with the stench of death, of crucified bodies, of a burnt temple and destroyed towns and villages. The new society that would displace Rome had not been realized, and Rome appeared victorious. And so the Gospel of Matthew, and perhaps the other 3 New Testament Gospels, but the Gospel of Matthew was written to address this situation. Now, what Rome did to Israel is shockingly parallel to what modern Israel, with the help of the United States, which is the modern Roman Empire, is now doing to the Palestinians. I purposefully called the events of 66 to 74 of the first century in Israel a catastrophe, because that is what Palestinians call the events of 1948, when the Zionists created the modern state of Israel by destroying over 500 Palestinian villages, massacring thousands of Palestinians, and driving more than 750,000 Palestinians into the West Bank and Gaza, or out of Palestine altogether. Ilan Pappy, an Israeli historian, has carefully researched and documented what happened and presented his findings in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And the ethnic cleansing has not stopped. Through constant settlement expansion, Israel has continued the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And after briefly pulling similar settlements out of Gaza, Israel has now unleashed a whirlwind of genocide in Gaza to drive out or kill as many Palestinians there as possible to reestablish the settlements. Gaza is being crucified. And there have been escalated attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank by Israel. Palestinians there are being killed, displaced, arrested, and tortured at record rates. So the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are being crucified. And this is happening after decades of brutal occupation. Both ancient Israel and modern Palestine suffered long occupations. Ancient Israel more than 120 years, modern Palestine 75 years, before the uprisings that brought about the respective genocides. just as historians, even ancient Jewish writers, focused on the uprising of 66 as the start of a war that resulted in the genocide. Many in the mainstream media today focus on the Hamas attacks of October 7th, 2023, as the beginning of a so-called war between Israel and Hamas. In reality, in both cases, the violence had been ongoing for decades. Every day before the uprising of 66, Romans had attacked, tortured, and killed Jews, and had built settlements in Israel. Every day before October 7th, 2023, Israel had attacked, tortured, and killed Palestinians, building settlements in Palestine. And surely Rome would have referred to the Jewish rebels as terrorists, had they had such a term. To them, the rebels were evil and worthy of crucifixion. But not only the rebels. Rome would punish as many Jews as they could. They would slaughter civilians, and they would even use starvation as a tactic. In the same way, Israel is using starvation as a weapon against Gaza today. But although Israel was destroyed in the years 66 to 74 of the first century, there were survivors, and the Jewish people continued to exist as a community, mostly in the diaspora, but even some in Palestine. In fact, there was at least one more uprising against Rome in Judea in the year 135. Israel was destroyed, but lived on. It was, in a way, resurrected in the Jewish people. And Jesus' followers survived and flourished because they had a story that had prepared them for this event. The story of Jesus, who had been crucified by the Romans and rose in victory over those who crucified him. The Jesus movement viewed Jesus' martyrdom as a victory over the powers that had crucified him and would crucify others in the movement. Well before the year 66, Paul declared, "We preach Christ crucified." Colossians 2:15 declares, "Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities. He made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." The early Jesus movement advanced through the victory of the cross, through the blood of the martyrs who followed Jesus in the way of the cross. Today, most Palestinians are Muslim, although there is a Christian minority that has been living there, existing there for centuries. But Palestinians have declared everyone killed by Israel to be a martyr. And they believe, as the early Jesus movement did, that every martyrdom contributes to their eventual victory over modern Israel and the United States. They too believe that martyrdom is a prophetic witness against the powers and authorities that are attacking and killing them, that the martyrs make a public spectacle of Israel and the United States. Just as the early Jesus movement, and in fact many other Jews of that era, saw resurrection as the ultimate triumph over the empire, as the other side of crucifixion, Palestinians today, whether Christian or Muslim, believe that their martyrs will live on in an afterlife, in a final triumph over their murderers. The author of the book of Revelation wrote of the defeat of the dragon, which gave power to the beast. The beast was an image of Rome. The dragon is identified in chapter 12 as, quote, "the devil and Satan." The dragon gave power to the beast. Satan gave power to the Roman Empire. In writing of the defeat of the dragon, the author of Revelation declares that the followers of Jesus defeated it, quote, "by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life, even in the face of death." In other words, their witness in martyrdom defeated the empire in a spiritual battle. And that is what is happening today. A spiritual battle is being waged. The people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank and their allies, and especially their martyrs, are waging a spiritual battle against the dragon, the satanic forces of empire and genocide, embodied in the governments and armed forces and the military-industrial complex of the United States and Israel. This is a spiritual battle, and history has shown, from the early Anabaptists to Gandhi to Martin Luther King, that the martyrs, when recognized as such, the martyrs always win. The Palestinians are recognizing, are honoring their martyrs, and we are too. When we honor the martyrs, it exposes the forces of empire for what they are. It rips away the veneer of pseudo-civilized democracy that claims to care about human rights. It lays bare the beast for what it is, so that it can be correctly judged in the heavenly courts, where morality, rather than might, decides who wins. The Palestinians and all who stand with them will win. The blood of the martyrs is even now exposing the beasts of empire and neocolonialism, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in the heavenly courts, where right prevails over might, where morality, decency, and honor decide the outcome. For this reason, we honor the martyrs, because we are making a claim for eternity. We are making a claim for the future, which is even now breaking into the present. In the court of heaven, we are making a claim for the new society, the kingdom of heaven, which is even now breaking into the world. For what we bind on earth is bound in heaven, and what we liberate on earth is liberated in heaven. Thank you for listening. This has been a special episode of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel.